Okay, welcome to, I'm Dr. Connie Silvan Sensor. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay. I want to extend a warm welcome to you for joining us from around the world. We're so happy that you've joined us for this interesting topic. I have the privilege of leading the delegation from the League of Women Voters of the United States during the 67th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. The League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan organization, encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education, advocacy, and litigation. We register voters, provide election information through voter guides, candidate forums, and debates. By empowering voters, we defend democracy. The League of Women Voters of the United States is an NGO affiliated with the United Nations Department of Global Communications in special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and has been actively engaged with the UN since its beginning in 1945. During the next 90 minutes, our panel of experts will share their thoughts about technology, friend or foe, of free, fair, and accessible elections. Voting is a pillar of democracy, and democracy is a pillar of human rights. Democratic societies, where everyone has the right to self-determination through free, fair, and accessible elections, are peaceful societies. So I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished panel, and you can also see their bios on the registration page. I invite them to add anything more that they would like to tell you about themselves when they begin speaking. I just want to do a short poll before we begin for the participants to see where you stand on this question. So I'm going to share the poll right now, and if you would like to log in your answers, we'll share the results of the poll. And the poll is up. You can see it? Yes. Okay. Looks like we have just about everybody weighing in. I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Can you see the results of the poll? So we have 73% that think it's friend and 27% that think it's foe. And as our distinguished panel of experts talk to you from their perspective, we'll see if your opinion changes at the end of the session. Okay. I invite you to post your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to answer as many as possible later in the presentation. I also want to add a special thanks to Jane Colvin and Sarah Hirsch, who are part of our League of Women Voters UN Observer team, for organizing and facilitating this webinar. There's also closed captioning available that you can open on an individual basis if you want to see the closed captioning. So here we go. No. Okay, so first I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Paul DeGregorio. He served as commissioner on the United States Election Assistance Commission from 2003 to 2007. And during his tenure at the EAC, he served a term as chairman. At the EAC, Mr. DeGregorio oversaw federal election reform, such as the implementation of Help America Vote Act and the establishment of the first federal certification on voting systems. Prior to the EAC, Mr. DeGregorio was executive vice president of the International Foundation for Election Systems. At IFES, he also was a senior election advisor and provided support and assistance in many emerging democracies. He promoted voting technologies and automation for disabled voters and overseas voters as chief of elections of Everyone Counts, Incorporated. DeGregorio has 38 years of election experience and was the director of elections for St. Louis County, Missouri, USA. He has provided technical assistance and has observed and assessed elections in more than 40 countries and is recognized as a global expert in the field of election administration. He has directed several OSCE, ODHIR recognized election observation missions and has served as a senior advisor to the Association of World Election Bodies and as a senior fellow to the Democracy Fund. DeGregorio has served on several boards and commissions and is frequent lecturer. He has been interviewed and quoted by media from all over the world and has authored numerous publications on the field of elections and democracy. DeGregorio received the Freedom Award from the National Association of Secretaries of State and was appointed a life member of the Intergenerational Association of Government Officials and the Association of European Election Officials. He is a graduate of the University of Missouri with a BA in political science. Mr. DeGregorio was honored by his alma mater with the Distinguished Alumni Award, and he resides in St. Louis, Missouri, USA. Michelle Bishop is the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at National Disabilities Rights Network, where she leads a team to support the Protection and Advocacy Network on voting rights and voter engagement for people with disabilities. She also works in coalition with the civil rights community in Washington, D.C. to ensure strong federal policy regarding voting rights and election administration from a voter-centric and intersectional perspective. She earned her MSW in Social and Economic Development from Washington University in St. Louis and a BA in Sociology and English Literature from the State University of New York at Geneseo. Disabled herself, Michelle comes to NDRN with over 20 years of experience in disability. So, welcome, Michelle. Pam Smith is the president and CEO of Verified Voting, and she plays a national leadership role in safeguarding elections and building working alliances between advocates, election officials, and other stakeholders. She is a member of the National Task Force on Election Crises, a diverse cross-partisan group of more than 50 experts whose mission is to prevent and mitigate a range of election crises by calling for critical preventative reforms to our election systems. Pam developed a trusted information resource on election equipment and the regulations governing its use at the federal level and across the 50 states. Pam is the author of and contributor to numerous key reports and issue briefs on protection of secret ballots, principles of post-election audits, state voting readiness, voting system testing and certification, accessible ballot marking principles, and other matters relating to election administration and verification. Welcome, Pam. And we have Alysoun McLaughlin, the Deputy Director of the Board of Elections in Montgomery County, Maryland. She began her career as an intergovernmental lobbyist, including several years at the National Association of Counties staff representing counties in Washington, D.C. After leaving NACO, she served as part of the startup team for election initiatives with the Pew Center on the States. In 2009, she accepted her first job as an election administrator, helping to implement omnibus election reform legislation with the District of Columbia Board of Elections. In 2012, she moved to her current position in Montgomery County, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C. Ms. McLaughlin has served as Vice President of the Maryland Association of Election Officials and is currently serving as co-chair of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Election Officials Committee, Vice Chair of the Election Subcommittee of the National Association of Counties, and as Secretary of the Election Assistance Commission Board of Advisors. So without further ado, I welcome our panels, and Mr. DeGregorio is going to be our first speaker.
Good afternoon, evening, or morning, where you may be at the moment. I would like to thank Connie and the United Nations, the League of Women Voters of the United States, and the organizers of this important webinar with the focus on innovation and technology. As the father of 4 daughters, I am honored to be on this panel with women who I have worked with and who have made a difference in this world, and especially in the field of elections, democracy, and innovation. I worked closely with the League in St. Louis and received an award from them way back in 1992. I worked with the UN on several projects, including guidelines for election observers. I would like to spend my few minutes discussing the global use of technology in the field of election, which has increased significantly in the past 20 years, and especially in the past 5 years with the global COVID-19 pandemic challenging election officials to find innovative solutions to serve voters. While technology has allowed for great innovation and flexibility in serving voters, its use has also raised questions of trust and fairness, and sometimes provides fodder for false information, reckless charges, and fake news about its use being spread that can lead to distrust in election outcomes. Election technology has focused on improving voter databases and registration, biometrics and other identification methods, electronic counting, faster and more accurate results, disability access, and serving diaspora of out-of-country voters. In recent years, technology has improved poll worker training and facilitating vote anywhere solutions and precise tracking of ballots and voting equipment, and improved election audits. I'm going to share some slides that help demonstrate where and what technology is used globally in elections. So give me a moment to share my screen here. There we go. My first slide has a quote from Tamir Javana, chair of the Central Election Commission of the Republic of Georgia, who has been a leader in introducing technology and new innovations in elections in her country. My second slide gives you some idea where electronic voting has been used throughout the world in this global map that was recently updated by International IDEA, which is a great source of international information on the conduct of elections. Electronic voting is defined by the use of a device that a voter can touch to make their choice on a ballot. That ballot can be then counted electronically or printed off to be counted by hand or by a scanner. Electronic voting can also be used to help voters with a disability, both privately and independently. It has been used quite successfully in the United States for that purpose. This is a map of where direct record electronic or touchscreen voting is used, which represents 50% of the countries using some type of electronic voting. So here's a slide with some pictures of some of the electronic voting devices that are used globally, including in the US. The top picture with the yellow is in Los Angeles County. But there's also examples here from Brazil, from India, and from other countries that use electronic voting. Biometrics is also used in technology in elections. And here's a slide showing election management bodies, that's EMBs, that use some type of biometrics, that is fingerprints and photos. You see in the green there, some countries just use fingerprints, some use both, or some just use that. But you see in many countries, including in the US, North America, Australia, biometrics is currently not really being used in the field of elections, but is an area that has grown, and particularly in African countries and emerging democracies where there's been problems with voter fraud and voter identification. Many countries use biometrics for voter identification at their polling stations, and you can see that countries down like in Brazil and South America and South Africa and others, India use biometrics to identify voters at the polling station. At some countries they use a biometric data, but it's in paper version. So they'll have a paper printout of somebody's picture before you cast the ballot. So it's used in many different ways. Here's a slide that shows some examples of biometrics that are being used in some countries to, including, electronic poll books that are being used throughout the world in countries. When you're introducing technology, it's very important to start slow, and many countries start with pilot programs. Equally important is full transparency, engagement of all stakeholders, management and professionalism, proper acquisition of technology, staff and poll worker training, civic education, and practicality of introduction and use and meeting the latest and highest standards and best practices. In the use of technology, one size never fits all. The United States has been a world leader in introducing guidelines and standards when it comes to the use of technology, but that's only been recently. When I was Election Assistance Commission that I once headed, it was in 2005, a year after we started up, that we implement the first federal voting system guidelines for the United States. The European Union has also published some suggested standards for the use of technology, which are being used in many countries, but there's no broad-based standards throughout the world. There's just standards in various areas, and countries generally set their own standards for the use of technology, looking at the guidance and best practices of other countries. The United States does go a little further than others, but we regulate, in some of our states, regulate our poll books. Not all of them do, but some do. So there are industry standards for the use of biometric technology, and I wanted to make sure that I point that out, that many standards that will use biometrics, whether it's fingerprint or photo, use standards that are set by institutions like the National Institutes for Standards and Technology in the US and IEEE. Since my time is limited, I wanted to point out before I end that women make up 22% of the chairs of election management bodies, and I have worked with and mentored many over the years. Such women leaders have been on the forefront of introducing technology to make voting more accessible. In Bosnia, it was a woman chair that introduced a pilot program to serve people with disability. In Georgia, as I showed earlier, the picture of Tamar, she introduced electronic voting and biometrics in her country. And recently in Moldova, they are looking at ways to use internet voting or remote voting to deal with the hundreds of thousands of voters who have left Moldova for other places because of the Ukraine war. Sadly, some of these women who've been in leadership positions have been subject to harassment and disinformation campaign, and their leadership has been undermined by some, but most of them are strong. And this slide of my friend Iriza Hasbidic, who served on the Bosnian Election Commission for over 12 years, including chair. I worked with her starting in 1999, encouraged her to have a career in elections, and she did. The other slide that I have is a picture of me an award that I received last November in Moldova for the work that I've done there with their election commission for the past 25 years. I'm going to share with you in the comment section 2 links of interest that you might want to copy and paste and look at later. One is about the leadership difficulties women in electoral leadership management have, and the other highlights women who have headed election observation missions. Both of them are very interesting articles that I think you might find very helpful if you're interested in this particular topic. So I'll stop there because I know there's other comments coming by my colleague panel, and I'll be available for questions afterwards. But Connie, thank you, and thank you to the panelists and to the participants.
Thank you so much, Paul. And that was really so interesting. I'm sure that so many of us were enlightened by things that we were not aware of before. And I'm certain that there will be questions coming. I'm going to turn it over now to Michelle Bishop and let her make her introductions.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to echo Paul's comments and saying thank you to Connie and to the United Nations and to the League of Women Voters of the United States for having us today. It's such a pleasure to be with you and an honor to get to share some of our knowledge and expertise with you. I appreciated that opening poll about is technology and elections friend or foe, because in my mind, it's probably always both, right? As you'll see from what I'm about to say, it's more friend than foe to me. My good friend Pam Smith and I may differ on that. We'll see. But anytime we introduce something new into a system, it's a little bit foe, right? It raises new questions and new things we have to account for. I have some slides I'm going to share with you as well. So let me go ahead and pull those up. So as you heard, my name is Michelle Bishop, and I'm the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at an organization called the National Disability Rights Network. We're based in Washington, D.C. I wanted to give you a quick overview of who we are so you have a sense of how you got stuck with me today and where some of our expertise and our experience is coming from. The National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN, as we're more commonly known, is a national membership organization for what's called the Protection and Advocacy, or P&A network. The P&As are actually federally mandated. They were created by the United States Congress. So they exist in every state, every district, and every territory in the US. There is one that is designated by the governor and all of those places. And P&As have a number of disability rights functions that they serve to protect the rights of people with disabilities where they are in all aspects of public life. But in particular, P&As are also federally mandated to protect and expand access to the vote for people with disabilities. And I am their point person in DC for the work they're doing there. So I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Well, let's talk about the stuff you actually want to hear about, right? Technology and voting. One of the most important things I can stress, and a lot of this will be from more of a domestic US perspective, because that's kind of the heart of the work we do, but we can talk a little bit about how that's applicable in a broader context. So to sort of frame the conversation, I wanted to touch on two important pieces of United States federal law here. First is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. It established a right to equal access under the law in all public accommodation. This was a sweeping landmark piece of civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. And importantly, it applies all the time. So it also applies to elections, but it also applies in non-federal elections, even though it's a piece of federal legislation. If you're having like a local school board election, the ADA still applies and says that people with disabilities have that right to equal access in the electoral process. It clearly applies to all methods of voting and all touch points that voters have with the process. That includes getting registered to vote, voter information that's made publicly available. If a state or a county elections official has a website, where they put information for voters on there, here's how you can find your polling place, here's a sample ballot, here's the election date, that's covered by the ADA. In-person voting, if you're going to a polling place or a vote center to cast your ballot, and any type of what you might call remote, absentee, or mail voting, anyone who is casting their ballots without going to a physical location. So we really have in the US a really fantastic basis in law for ensuring that people with disabilities will be enfranchised and have access to the vote. And it's had pretty broad and sweeping implications. And I do think it has partially helped to usher technology into the process, because a lot of what makes the world more broadly accessible for people with disabilities is the use of technology, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the basis of the conversation is, of course, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, the infamous piece of federal legislation that followed the debacle of the 2000 United States presidential election, where we had the punch card ballot systems, and you had the hanging chads and the pregnant chads and all the chads that made it a little bit unclear who voters intended to vote for. So the Help America Vote Act guarantees a private and an independent ballot for all eligible voters. So we have that equal access under the law, and we also have the idea that your ballot should be private and independent. It led to replacement of those punch card systems with more accessible voting systems. I'm not going to call them fully accessible. I don't think anything is really fully accessible. It could always be stronger, but it is more accessible than some of our traditional ways of voting. As Paul mentioned, it created the voluntary voting system guidelines that do have a lot of standards in there for what would make a system accessible. And it actually is the piece of legislation that created the role for the P&A network in protecting and expanding access to the vote. So that's how we get here. So some examples of what innovation looks like in terms of voter access for people with disabilities. Let's get to the good stuff. And I'll try to keep my remarks short, of course, because I know my colleagues need to speak as well. One is online voter registration, which is becoming increasingly common in the United States. This is used in many states. One of the sticking points, I think, between accessibility of elections and the security of elections is the use of paper. Paper traditionally for many people with disabilities is just not accessible. People with print disabilities are not going to be able to receive, handle, mark, verify a piece of paper if I'm blind or low vision, if I have a reading or a learning disability, if I have a physical disability that limits use of my hands, all of those things. So that's where we really start to bring technology into the process. And it starts right at voter registration rather than having to. When I registered to vote, I went to my local library and got a paper registration card and filled it out with a pen. And I was going to say mailed it back, but I might have personally dropped it off at the elections office. I was very excited about voting when I turned 18. It's the traditional way we register to vote, but increasingly you can do that online. And once you have those online portals, if they're designed accessibly for people with disabilities, they really expand access there. As I talked about, election websites and online sample ballots, the more we're able to provide information to voters to figure out how they're going to cast their ballots in a number of different formats, the more accessible that information is. Electronic voting systems at polling places. These last two are probably the biggies in terms of friend or foe that we're going to talk about today. And I have an image here of an ES&S Express vote. We don't endorse any particular system, but this is a very common one in the United States. So I thought that image may look familiar, but electronic voting systems at polling places in the United States these days are typically something very similar to this. You have a touchscreen interface. You also have the ability to use headphones for an audio ballot. If you can't access the touchscreen, you can also input devices that you use that make the system accessible to you. A sip and puff for people who are quadriplegics that don't have any movement from the neck down, where they can literally breathe into a straw that can control electronic devices they can plug into this system. So it has a number of accessibility features that just drastically expand the accessibility of the ballot from just having to pick up that paper and that pen and hand mark it. We previously more commonly used systems that recorded the vote electronically, which was more accessible, but due to security concerns, it's now something that looks more like this, where you can see it created a paper printed ballot. So it really does a good job of making marking the ballot more accessible for people with disabilities. We haven't really figured out yet how to keep paper in the system and make verifying and casting fully private and independent for people with disabilities. And the last that was a big issue around the 2020 election because of COVID and social distancing is electronic remote voting. The idea that rather than receiving a paper ballot in the mail to vote absentee or vote remotely, that you can receive and mark that ballot electronically and potentially even return it electronically, whether or not that's through an e-fax or email or uploading it to an online portal, any of those range of options. This is something that we do routinely for military and overseas American citizens, but we've seen an expansion of that into creating access for people with disabilities who might be stateside, but for whom having to receive and hand mark and fold up and mail that piece of paper is a barrier. So that is a very quick overview about what technology looks like in the elections world for people with disabilities. This is my last little bit of information here, kind of in summary. The main points that I would want you to remember from what I've said: private independent ballots are in themselves also a security feature in our elections. If I don't have to rely on someone else to mark it for me, particularly if I'll never get to see it to verify that it was marked the way I intended, there is a risk of tampering there in terms of the votes. So the more our ballots are private and independent, the more accurate our elections are. The use of technology in voting, bringing electronics into voting, is the primary way that we've provided access to all aspects of the vote for people with disabilities. And the last 20 years alone, it's been a game changer for all aspects of life for people with disabilities, but also in the world of voting and elections. And access to the vote in the United States is a matter of federal law. So when we look at election security solutions, we have to be able to come up with solutions that balance both and don't disenfranchise people with disabilities. There are many countries that have laws similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act that would afford the same protections, or countries that have signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which in many ways it draws from the ADA, that would also provide similar protections as well. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass off to my co-panelists. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much. That was really giving us a lot of information, and I'm sure things that can be taken away from, along with our participants, for making positive changes in their own communities. So thank you. I'm going to now turn over to Pam Smith, and thank you so much, Michelle, and welcome, Pam.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to League of Women Voters, UN, for having me. I've been living and breathing election technology for nearly 20 years, so I'm excited for this topic, and it's great to see my colleagues here again. And it's my birthday, so I get to celebrate with all of you. Cake comes later. So I want to talk about the fact that people legitimately want to know that elections are righteous. The undermining of the public's ability to trust in elections is one of the most severe dangers to democracy today. And technology has a role to play in this, both, I would say, both friend and foe. And like Michelle, I probably lean toward friend. One challenge is the capability for mis and disinformation to be spread by social media on the internet at incredible speeds, and that's substantially different than in past decades. At the same time, more information about elections directly from the source, election officials, is now available online, and that wasn't always the case. So as long as there have been elections, there have been issues and challenges and tampering with elections and problems. Those issues are different at different points in history, starting with who gets to vote and who doesn't, which is still an issue. But aside from that, in the past, very little technology was used in elections until probably about 100 years ago. Ballots were hand-marked or pre-printed. Communities would hand count votes with the whole public watching. It was all very transparent and low tech, but also not very many voters, and some left out of the process and not much secrecy. Some countries do still hand count successfully, mainly because of how few items are on the actual ballot. But today, most elections are carried out with software and computerized systems in most aspects of elections. Things that by their nature can be hacked or tampered with can also just have failures and bugs and glitches and not work like it's supposed to. The basic rule for securing anything computerized like that, you need availability, confidentiality, and integrity. You need a way to keep systems up and running, a way to protect data from both malfeasance and malfunction, and to be able to recover when something goes wrong. And in elections, that means making sure voters can vote and making sure you can find the right outcome, even if or even when something does go wrong. Sort of a low-tech way to back up the high-tech. Using a hybrid of paper for verification and for backup, and technology for access and aiding with the demands of running elections is kind of a good combination. So everybody has mentioned many places that technology touches elections, not just voting, how we provide information, register, check the movement of voters from one state to another, update registration lists, check people in, mark ballots, count votes, even auditing the vote. All of that has to be available and working right. And secure elections require us to be able to demonstrate that that was the case. If a voter doesn't get a chance to participate in an election because their state doesn't make it easy, or because on their way to casting a ballot, something went wrong with the technology between them and voting, that's just not what democracy is about. And it's not going to give voters a basis for confidence in the election. It's important to know the infrastructure of democracy is resilient. and that every voter who wants to participate has an ability to cast an effective ballot. And that for us means looking at the security of elections in a voter-centered way. Effective to me means the voter is not hindered from voting by a failed electronic check-in system or poll book or a tampered registration list, that the ballot is available to the voter, including any system used for marking the ballot, that they get the right ballot, it's complete, there's no missing contests or candidates, it's feasible to mark and check that physical ballot and cast the ballot safely and privately, and that the ballot is counted correctly along with all the other ballots, and that we can demonstrate that fact to the satisfaction of the public, including those on the losing side. And paper is important to the equation because it does provide a physical record of voter intent if the voter has a chance to verify that it faithfully represents their choices at the time they're voting. And that means you can use that record to check that the votes were counted correctly through an audit or recount. Doesn't matter what kind of counting system you're using. The paper without assistive technology obviously presents a challenge, but one which many people are working constantly to try and remedy. I worked on the Los Angeles County ballot marking system development project as a technical advisor, and it incorporated a way to provide accessible verification and casting. It feels like we're on the right road to expanding that. Tech probably has the answer at some point. So there's many thousands of jurisdictions, all doing elections somewhat differently in the United States. So a patchwork of systems. I'm going to screen share and just show you a tool briefly that shows you what I'm talking about here. Can everyone see the map? So this is a map that we have at our website that it's actually many maps. This one is the election day equipment map, and it shows you what each state is using, whether they're using primarily hand-marked paper ballots and ballot marking devices for accessibility, whether they use ballot marking devices for all voters, whether they use direct recording electronic. And these are some of the ones that, that were talked about by my colleagues already. I'll just show you, if you drill down and look at a map of a particular state, you can see how that state breaks down and then specifically what they're using in any given county. So Los Angeles County, for example, I mentioned the voting system that they're using. If you look further down on the page, you can see information about the specific equipment that's in use, and you can click through to any of those clickable links and it'll tell you what it looks like, how it works, how it gets used. You can also look at maps that show what accessible equipment is in place, what's being used for electronic poll books, how old the equipment is, and what kind of audit laws are available. So I hope everyone takes a moment to visit that. When verified voting started in 2004, we started gathering that data. And like I said, most local jurisdictions didn't even have websites at that time. Huge tech advancement in providing information to the public now. At that time, only a handful of states had paper ballots. Only about 3 had a requirement in statute to audit the vote. Now there's only a handful that don't have paper. About 5 to 7% of voters in the US live in them. And most states have passed requirements to audit the vote count using those paper ballots. And the 2020 election was said to be the most secure in American history from the by the former head of DHS cybersecurity. He based that on the fact that there are paper ballots to show voter intent nearly everywhere and post-election audits to check those vote counts in most jurisdictions now. And a third key point, equipment not connected to the internet. And that's because connecting things to the internet makes them vulnerable. For some things, for many things, that vulnerability can be mitigated, managed well enough to do it safely, like registering to vote and sharing election information. For votes, it's something that the technology doesn't yet do. It's a good thing to not connect voting machines to the internet, but we still send votes over the internet in some cases. And disappointingly, electronic ballot return in all of its forms sacrifices both secrecy and security. Every state in the US calls for a secret ballot, whether in statute or constitution, but requires voters to waive the right in order to vote that way. They don't warn about security. So there's ways in which you can do some pieces of this more safely. Online ballot marking has security risks to integrity and availability of a single voter's ballot, so moderate risk. electronic ballot return creates significant risks to the confidentiality of the ballot and voter information, voter data rather, and availability of the system. But there's some good news here. There's people working on this all the time. And I think that leaves us in an odd place because we already have a large number of jurisdictions across the country and several countries that are doing this already. And it's something that hasn't yet been figured out how to make safe. There's a federal security analysis that says if officials are mandated to employ this high-risk process, it should be limited to voters who have no other means to return their ballot and have it counted. And the final section of this working group report is on balancing security and accessibility, and it acknowledges the risks. And at the same time, it points out that eliminating these forms of voting without reasonable alternatives could produce an unacceptable risk and also be violation of laws, like Michelle said. Expanding them could produce unacceptable security risks to those same voters and to the integrity of the election. So they recommend that those administering elections are the final arbiters of risk and consider the needs and legal requirements in addition to security when making these decisions. So if you ask proponents of internet voting whether this is something all voters should use, many will say we're not ready for that yet. The assumption is it's only a smallish number of ballots, maybe not enough to sway an outcome if there were a problem. Another way to think about it is those particular ballots can be targeted by an evildoer. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what all the possible solutions are. And the challenges are different for different groups of remote voters. And one thing I think about is what if instead of passing laws that suggest this can be done securely at this point, without guardrails, what if election officials were authorized to be the arbiter of risk? What if they could make exceptions when needed, when voters have no other option to return their ballot and have it counted, but make it the exception, not the rule? And importantly, I think, what if in the meantime, we could ensure reasonable alternatives are expanded? Certain situations make it harder for some people to vote, and we need to look at all the ways we can solve that safely. A very positive development using technology, which I'm proud to have worked on with partners from usability and accessibility advocacy communities, is remote accessible vote by mail, which when well deployed enables a voter to receive a ballot electronically that can be marked remotely and returned by mail by most voters, not all. Doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a starting point and one that can help a large number of voters without adding additional risk, and it should already be in place everywhere, and yet it's not. We know how to do that safely. We can do better on making the systems more accessible still. I think in closing, I'll just say it's absolutely critical to democracy and to finding technology solutions to find common ground, and it's also crucial to lift up those who sacrifice a great deal in the service of democracy, the frontline workers in elections and the election officials, the majority of whom I will point out are women. They face unprecedented and unfounded challenges and attacks, but they're you, they're your neighbors, they're your sisters, they might be your grandma, they're your local community members, and they're all dedicated to the proposition that democracy both requires and deserves all of us working together to make this incredible thing called an election happen. They're about voters, they're about us. So I recommend let your local officials know that you appreciate them. Write to them, send cookies, send flowers, volunteer to become a poll worker, and bring your friends, and mostly show up and vote. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pam. That was, I'm sure gave us a lot of more questions than answers, I think, but isn't that what perspective transformation is all about? Questions beget questions. And so then we seek answers and we do a little bit of a deeper dive. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Alysoun now. And I remind the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, you can put them in the Q&A, and we will proceed to answer some of your questions when Alysoun is finished. So Alysoun, it's all you.
Thank you so much, Connie. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm truly honored to be a part of it. And I want to thank the UN Commission on Women and the League of Women Voters for your work over the years in promoting free, fair, and accessible elections globally and here in the United States. What I'd like to do in this, in my part of our panel here today is to personalize this a little bit as the election official on the panel here speaking with you, to talk about my experience of technology and to talk about, I really want to talk about two things. I want to talk about technology, but I do want to talk about the role of women in the workplace of elections as well. As Connie noted, I've been an election official now in one of the larger jurisdictions in the United States for over 13 years at this time. And I've been a part of implementing 2 entire new voting systems, 3 rounds of either implementing or replacing electronic poll books, implementing online and automatic voter registration in 2 different jurisdictions. And I've used or experimented with any number of different software packages, communications platforms, tools for communicating with voters, and for communicating with the thousands of citizen volunteers who serve at our polling places on election day, during early voting, and as part of the process that we use for counting the vote by mail ballots as well. And to me, technology is neither friend nor foe. It's a necessity. It's a tool. We all use technology in our everyday life, and we all manage and protect our work from the risks that are presented by whether that's individuals attempting to use technology maliciously, or from other threats. And election officials are, I would say, in my relationships with election officials and in my own life of this, we are by habit and training a cautious bunch when it comes to the use of technology. Most of us are middle-aged women, which I'll get to in a second and has been alluded to earlier in the panel as well. We spend all day all year preparing for the election season, working to make sure that it goes off without a hitch, working to build redundancies into our systems to protect our data and to protect our processes from malicious actors. And those malicious actors could be candidates trying to gain an advantage. They could be foreign actors who are trying to sow the seeds of doubt in our democracy, or they could be truly the simplest of insider threats, which is a threat of errors that we cannot afford. And so in the course of that, technology is essential to our work, of course, communicating with our workforce, communicating with our voters, tabulating results, presenting that information to the public, all essential functions of our democracy. And so my role as an election administrator is really the same as any other public administrator performing an essential function in our government, whether that is our peers in the workforce and public health, in emergency management, in law enforcement, to ensure the security of our data and to ensure the reliability of our infrastructure and the integrity of both our data and our processes. Now, technology is, of course, a challenge. Elections are no longer as much of a one-day event as they used to be, now that we've had the expansion of early voting and vote by mail. And so we have a little bit more of an opportunity to do iterative improvements over the course of an election, but we still scale up our workforce dramatically for an election, and then we scale it back down again dramatically. In my office, approximately 90% of our workforce for any election is seasonal temporary staff. And then we have thousands of the citizen volunteer poll workers that we train for anywhere from a single day of work to potentially 2 to 6 weeks of work. And we scale down to a skeleton crew in the off season that is responsible for year-round voter registration, that is responsible for the year-end work of staffing that event of the democracy. And so that is a really an elastic workforce, and it is a workforce that is heavily women and often middle-aged women or retirees, which brings me to the second theme that you've heard interwoven in the presentations throughout the day. And I want to address a little bit directly and draw your attention to some work. I don't have slides to share, but you can Google it. The Google search term you want to use is Stewards of Democracy. It's some recent work that the Democracy Fund and Reed College did a survey of local election officials and did some analysis of the demographics of local election officials. And that was building on some work that was actually done by the Congressional Research Service almost 20 years ago, where in 2004, 63% of election officials were over age 50. That has gone up It has not gone down. We have not seen the generational turnover that we might have expected, with the baton being passed to a younger workforce as work became more complex over the years. Instead, what has happened is that the age of election officials has gone up. It was 63% in 2004 that were over age 50, and now it's 75% that are over age 50. Similarly, the percentage of women, although it's a much lesser of a shift and maybe statistically not a huge shift, but in 2004, 75% of election officials were women. And that number now is 80% of election officials who are women. And so truly what you're seeing is in many ways, election administration as women's work, election administration as something that is disproportionately compared to others in the workforce of government, to other public administrators and administrative managers in our government, something that that women are responsible for and that women take on as a career path. And I'd like you all to take that information and take that and overlay it on your own experience of the last few years and your own experience of really the traumatic experience that we've all been through as a society of the global pandemic. And in the course of administering the elections of the 2020 election cycle for us here in the United States, and then the 2022 election cycle here in the United States, where we saw a lot of change in 2020 to adapt to the new realities of what voters needed from their government in the midst of the pandemic. And then in 2022, an expansion and retention of those options and making sure that we both provided the types of services that we had provided prior to the pandemic, and then of course provided the expanded opportunities for vote by mail and other forms of voting that we implemented during the pandemic. And so we are now in the position we are we're doing both. We're doing each of the things that we did prior to 2020 and in 2020 as well. And when you reflect on your own experience and what we all saw as the struggle that we all faced in balancing work and family and balancing our own responsibilities to our profession, our own responsibilities to our family, our own responsibilities really to our society in the course of this last couple of years, public administrators, and in particular, I would say the women who are the public administrators who run our elections, have truly been called upon to do much more with much less. And labor availability has been an extraordinarily challenge. A lot of the women of that sandwich generation who both have their own children to take care of and maybe have parents that they needed to take care of in the course of this really traumatic couple of years have left the workforce, have retired. And many who were there have really burned out, faced challenges, faced struggles in trying to really navigate the complexity and the challenges of this essential service that we provide, and making sure that we provide it to really the higher level of customer service that voters demanded of their government and required of our government over the course of these last few years. We turn to our government to comfort us and to provide an escalated level of customer service over the course of the last few years to really reassure people about the health, the integrity, the functioning of our government and the functioning of our democracy. And so I really, all those who are concerned about, focused on the health of our democracy, the path ahead to making sure that we meet the challenges that that we face. One of the things that we really need to focus on is the health of our workforce, the health of our pipeline, and making sure that we support and we bring new people into the profession of election administration, that we bring new people into the environment of the polling place, where we once relied on a lot of older individuals to serve in polling places on election day and during those other in-person voting opportunities that we provide. And we saw many leave that citizen workforce as well over the course of the pandemic. So, we've done a lot to try to build the pipeline of younger workers through the pandemic, but at the same time, we face those challenges where that is that's the reality of what we are facing. And so what I really want to call to everyone here in terms of your own personal relationship with our democracy is to reflect on where you can be a part of it and where you can be a part of becoming the next wave of poll workers, or where you can become a part of recruiting those to assist you in serving our democracy, being a part of it, becoming part of that truly organic network and system of the way that elections are conducted in your jurisdiction, where you live, getting to know the processes, getting to know the technology, and getting to know how you can be a part of both participating in our democracy and making sure that you help build the supports and help build that pipeline of others to participate and take ownership and what we can all do to continue to maintain and sustain a healthy, vibrant democracy. And with that, I know that Connie has other questions for the panel, and so I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Alysoun. I actually, since we have you on screen at the moment, the question that I would have for you, thank you for your excellent presentation too. I think you really hit the heart of women and how we are called upon to do so many roles, responsibilities, shared responsibilities between family and workplace, and other things that we're committed to, and yet we still volunteer. We still are there for free, fair, and accessible elections. And we need to amplify that voice. And I think, like anything else, if you're united, your voice gets louder. And so I hope that women have taken that message away from what you've told us. So the question to you is, what is the most important thing that you want poll workers to know, and why?
The most important thing that I want poll workers to know is that we, as the election officials in your jurisdiction, are here to support you in becoming a part of our process, not only in being a voter, but in becoming a part of bringing democracy to your friends, to your family, to your neighbors. And I encourage you to reach out to us and become a part of the democratic process.
Thank you. And I think your message too is that you can do this in a very nonpartisan way. It doesn't mean that you have to be a campaigner for one party or another, or one candidate or another. You're just saying to people it's important to vote, and what can we do to help facilitate that process for you? How can we make it easier for you to vote? And I think that that's what democracy is all about. So thank you. I have a question for Paul, and it is, what is the most effective use of technology that you've encountered in election monitoring that can be adopted by other election administrators in this and other countries? So
thank you, Connie. I cut my teeth in the early days on punch card voting when I was in St. Louis County, and we had it all over the country. And then when I did work overseas, there was also paper ballots that were counted. What I saw with both methods was that voters made mistakes. Now, certainly punch card had its issues, but even with paper ballots, generally speaking, we would see 1 to 3% of the voters who would mark twice on their ballot, undervote their ballot, and that wouldn't be caught. One advantage that I have found with electronic voting, where the ballots can be marked, on paper, but processed electronically through a scanner or some device, is that it kicks out an overvote, it kicks out an undervote, and it gives those voters a second chance to correct their ballot. So probably more than anything else, that I see as helped. But I also have to mention allowing people with disabilities to cast their votes privately, independently. I mean, I've seen that throughout the US and some other countries, but mainly the US. And, that really is an important development that has helped millions of people the opportunity to vote privately and independently. And lastly, we see so many people who live abroad, and Pam mentioned this opportunity that US voters have to get their ballots sent electronically, printed off and sent back. That's been a big help. And if you see the numbers, how they've changed in the last 10 years and enabling the number of Americans abroad to cast their ballots. And in many countries of the world, we're seeing people spread out. I mean, just look at Ukraine. I mean, I have my Ukraine tie on today. I always wear it these days. And in October of this year, they have to have their parliamentary elections. And in April of next year, they have to have their presidential elections. And there's ongoing discussions going on how they're going to do that with millions of people abroad. And so they're looking at perhaps some kind of technology, American style or what other, that's going to allow people abroad to cast their ballots in their elections so democracy can continue. So those are just some of the, things that I have seen, in my career that electronic voting has helped people cast their ballots.
Thank you. I think that's something really important to consider, because people are migrating. I mean, obviously for the purposes that their country is war torn, and they need to move on. But we also now have something else to consider with climate migration, right? People whose homes are disappearing due to climate change and migrating in other places. And again, how do you track those people, and how do you allow them to continue to participate in the democratic process in their native countries? So you raised some really good points there, and I'm so impressed with the Ukrainian tie, as I hope other people are in support of our friends and colleagues in Ukraine. So Pam, the next question is for you. If you'd like to add anything to what Paul said, and then I'd like the question that I'm posing to you to be, please comment on the status and the future of ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, now that there are that 3 states more have left it.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I feel like this is, people have to be careful not to shoot themselves in the foot here. This is a system that is run by and controlled by its state members. So it's nonpartisan. And its purpose is to maintain confidence in our elections by keeping voter rolls up to date. And one of the challenges, each state has their own statewide voter registration system and database. But what happens when a person moves out of that state or moves into that state from another state? How are you able to track that kind of movement? How are you able to track to the maximum amount possible whether a person has died and you still have them on your voter rolls, for example? How can you use that information to make sure people are not voting in 2 different states in a given election, right? And so this tool enables list sharing in such a way that protects confidential information, but it uses actually pretty complex technology to do matching of information and find out whether the voter rolls are up to date. And it enables those states to reach out to people who have recently moved to their state to say, hey, you're new here, would you like to register? Which they wouldn't know that if not for this. And so I feel like it's an incredibly important tool. It does improve election security, and it is not a partisan thing. It's important not to play politics with election integrity. There's no viable alternative to this system. So some states are thinking, well, maybe we'll do our own version of this. That hasn't worked out in the past, partly because of how complex it is. So I feel like it's really important to stay in, because the more information that's there, the better. And I'm happy to report, being a Californian, that there's now a bill in California's legislature that might add California to ERIC finally at long last if it passes. So, and that's 1 in 10 voters in the country. That's like a massive number. So I feel like that's really going to be very helpful.
Thank you, Pam.
Yeah.
And a question for Michelle. Could you please comment on the challenges that voters with cognitive disabilities may face and what's available to help them? Because I think it's more obvious to us when people have physical disabilities, but when you have cognitive disabilities, we're not always sure how to respond to that.
That's a great point, Connie, because I think we very clearly understand if I use a wheelchair and there's stairs with no ramp, that's not accessible to me. It's really clear. It's really easy to grasp. And the fixes make sense, right? Put in a ramp or put up a portable ramp. The door is too heavy, prop it open. There are things that I think are very easy to understand and come up with good workable solutions for. When it comes to access for people with cognitive disabilities, the barriers are different. It's not necessarily so much those physical barriers as it is access to information and successfully casting your ballot. I think that the use of electronic voting machines in polling places has been a huge benefit to people with cognitive disabilities. I know people with cognitive disabilities who say they voted privately and independently for the first time when they used one of those machines rather than a punch card system, which quite frankly, it was kind of difficult for anyone to understand if they were really honestly, truly marking the right place. It took the ballot and made it clear. It gave it a more simple design. It gave the ability to listen if reading some of the information was a challenge. It gave you the ability to just kind of touch a touch field rather than worry that you're not, filling in a bubble correctly if you get that anxiety about taking those fill in the bubble tests like I do. So it made the process, simplified the process, and certainly helped people with cognitive disabilities to make a choice that reflects their actual intentions and feel confident about that. It's really powerful if you know people with cognitive disabilities to hear them talk about voting independently for the first time. I have watched people cry. It's a really, really incredible thing. And it really drives a lot of this work for me to know that it's so meaningful for people with disabilities. So I do think embracing technology makes a big difference. We want to make sure we do it well. So a lot of that for people with cognitive disabilities is also about good design. The display that you're looking at, whether or not it's an online voter registration portal or an electronic vote by mail system or a voting system in a polling place, should be clear and clutter-free. It should have really obvious navigation features. Like every time I click on this image, it should take me to the same place. So I know to look for that image if there's somewhere I'm trying to go. You shouldn't have to scroll over too far or through too many pages. It should use clear and simple language. Which I can't stress enough. A lot of voters, even voters who don't have cognitive disabilities, are sometimes intimidated by some of these voting systems because they use some complex language and they make it quite clear what can happen if you make a mistake, and it just intimidates voters. So I think we're doing a decent job of leveraging technology to make the process more accessible, which does benefit people with cognitive disabilities, but we also have to make sure we're doing that well. Good design goes a long way to make voting more accessible to everyone, to improve the accuracy of voters marking their ballots, to improve confidence in elections. So I think that's really the next step in the process for making sure that we're making voting more accessible for everyone.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to Sarah. She's been collecting the questions and answers from our audience. And again, I remind the audience, if there's anything else that you would like to ask our panelists, please enter in the Q&A. And also to point out that in the webinar chat, we have the resources listed that our speakers have addressed in their presentations. So make sure that you check that out as well. Thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
So this first question is from Sandra, and she asks, are there any new election technology innovations in the works? And if so, what are they, and when, where will they be available? So I don't know if maybe Paul, do you want to start with that, or Pam?
Yeah, I can tell you some of the latest. 5 years ago, I was in South Korea, and I witnessed for the first time they developed an app, and they developed a vote anywhere solution for anywhere in the country where you could get your ballot. And it also had the wait times for the polling stations, and you press a button, shows you how to get to the polling station quickly. And now I've seen that adopted in the US. In my own county here, St. Louis County, they adopted that. And I know that they're doing this in other places. So there's some new technology that's making it easier for voters to cast their ballot. And especially when you have a pandemic and you've had to consolidate polling stations, having vote centers where people can vote anywhere seems to be an area that I find is new, and it's being adapted. I don't know if Alysoun probably keeps track of some of this more in the U.S., and I don't know if she has more to add about some new being used in the U.S. that might be helpful for others throughout the world.
I think I would say, just to jump in here, that by and large, I don't think you're going to see elections drive innovation. You're not going to see the cutting edge of new things in technology in use by and large in election administration, precisely because of the kinds of concerns that Pam was speaking to earlier. And that trust and confidence has to be there for everybody, has to be there for the officials who are driving this process to be able to count on it and not take risks that we aren't ready to support. And so with that general statement, as far as addressing sort of the fear of innovation getting ahead of where we are as a society or what we're ready to do as a government, I would say that what I have seen most of out of necessity over the course of the last couple of years has been advancement in what we do to communicate with voters, advancement in trying to communicate out to voters. Where's my ballot? Has my ballot been received yet? Really making use of the kinds of technology that are available in the private sector and other applications, and using them more and more in our process of helping the voter as a consumer experience the process.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that and say that there's technology out there that will look new when you see it, but it's been around for a little while and maybe just in some places. And I think that you'll see more and more jurisdictions adopting ballot tracking mechanisms, which let you follow your ballot from when it's coming out from the elections office to when it gets back there and is included. Things like that are really helpful when we're expanding vote by mail, right? So there are also, I think on the ballot scanning side, there are some improvements that are enabling ballots to scan actual words as opposed to a mark in a specific place or a QR or barcode, which means that what a voter sees on their ballot and verifies is what is actually getting counted because it's scanning from the names of the candidates. That's a form of optical character recognition or optical word recognition that can be enhanced, and systems are starting to be provided or available that are using that. That's a big plus for verification. So yeah, I think there are a number of some kind of nonprofit entries into the marketplace, if you will. The voting system marketplace is not huge, even though it might seem like it is. And jurisdictions tend to keep their voting system for a little while because of the cost. So what that means is it's not sort of a big profit-driven, lots of innovation all the time. But there are some nonprofits or organizations that work on open source, for example, that are finding ways to address security, accessibility, and cost kind of all in one. And I think we'll see more and more of those as we move forward.
Thank you. So the next question is from Jeanette, and she asks, how do you think social media can be used constructively to increase election information and accessibility?
Well, I have a thought, but I'm piggybacking on something else and said, one of the challenges we've seen is that a lot of the questions that come up about elections are questions that really the best person to answer is the elections office. And that information being out there is great. Elections officials have started, over the last decade to be using social media to help transmit their message and inform voters who might be on social media about the upcoming election and how to find your polling place and all of those kinds of things. And they found challenges through the social media companies in getting themselves, authorized, I guess it would be, so that what they're trying to post doesn't get blocked as being some kind of, possible election disinformation. It sounds crazy, but that process of making sure that election officials can actually post what they need to post and be, seen as legitimate and authorized is really an important thing.
I think I would say that in addition to the accessibility of social media as a way for election officials to get out our message, it's back to the sort of friend or foe construct of social media can cut both ways. And you certainly can have the spread of disinformation, but you also have that ability to get information out, and to get information out through networks, and to have others, while we're in the trenches of administering the election itself, people have the ability to jump into the social media space and to amplify our information and to get tools out there. And what I've really been heartened by in the course of the last few years has the extent to which the candidates and the workers in the space of democracy and the political parties have really embraced the opportunity to try to get information out that is accurate, and to sort of do the work of the information quality of getting information out to voters that is amplifying the voice of the administrators and is getting facts out there into a space that can be very noisy, but where people follow who they want to follow. They follow the candidates, who are of their political party. They follow the voices that speak to their perspective. And so when our information can get to those intermediaries, then it can get out into the world and out into the space where voters are paying attention.
If I can add to that quickly as well, I think that from an accessibility perspective for people with disabilities, we push a lot for information to be provided in multiple formats, right? Don't just mail, a paper mailing with important information to voters. It should also be up on a website. You should be on the local news and the local radio. And I think that social media is one more way to get that information out there. And one of the things I like about it, it does come with some cons, right? Misinformation spreads really fast on social media, but not every local elections official has the resources to have a website. They don't all have websites at the county level, and social media is free. So long as you've got the time or the staffing capacity to put updates there, it's just another way of getting out information electronically and over the internet without necessarily having to hire a web designer, especially because building a website that's accessible and compliant with federal law is not something that every web designer you're going to find knows how to do. So it takes some of those things out of the equation when resources are limited. And I think it's also practical, as Alysoun was saying, for getting information out there quickly. Sometimes things happen. I work with our election protection efforts on election day. Something goes wrong in a jurisdiction early in the day, and that jurisdiction might extend voting hours. Polls were supposed to close at 7. They're going to be open till 9. Voters need to know that they have 2 more hours. They should stay in line. They should go back if they didn't get a chance to vote earlier. Social media is a way to get that information out quickly, somewhere where people might see it, especially as Alysoun was saying, if you can get parties and campaigns and those folks to follow you, they're going to see it and they have a real, they have to send that information out, right? Because they're trying to get their voters out. So they need their voters to know you have more time. Things like that happen on the fly. I think social media is a great way to get that information out there. Of course, I have to add the caveat, you want to make sure you're doing it accessibly. If you're posting videos, you need to have captioning for people who are deaf and audio description for people who are blind. If you post images, especially information, charts, and graphs, it should have alternative text so that people who can't see it can have it read to them, and those sorts of things. But I do think it's a good option, knowing that our elections officials, unfortunately, are just under-resourced.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then for the other questions that are still open, I guess folks can, we'll have our panelists provide responses, but this question comes from Jane. So what is your opinion of AI? Can it be relied upon to keep elections free, fair, and accessible?
I typed a reply to that just now. Jury's still out. Look, the ground truth for elections information is still election officials. So, and AI has some incredible capabilities, as we've been seeing in the news recently. How do we know whether it's right or not? How do we know whether it's being used? Well, I think it's important to still rely on election officials directly. I hope that helps.
Okay, I'll turn it back to you, Connie.
All right, so I thank you all for participating today, and our panelists are answering some of the questions that we didn't get to directly in the Q&A. And I would just like at this point to I'm going to run the poll one more time that we started in the beginning, whether you feel that technology is a friend or foe to fair, free, and accessible elections. You've certainly heard some enlightening perspectives about where that goes. And then I'm going to offer to our panel the opportunity to make closing remarks and answer this question in their remarks if they like. How can we take advantage of opportunities to empower voters while mitigating potential risks to vulnerable populations? And that really is the crux of the question we were trying to answer today. So I'm going to run the poll for 1 minute and then turn it back to our panelists and give them a couple minutes each to wrap up with their closing remarks. Here's the poll. Okay, and I invite the audience to answer. Oh, we have a change. It looks like there's a change amongst us. Okay. We're going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're going to end the poll and share the results.
Interesting.
You see that there's a shift. We now feel that more of our audience feels that technology is a friend rather than a foe, 88% to 12%. So I think you have provided much enlightenment. So I'm going to go back to our panelists for closing remarks. And I guess maybe go in, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, reverse order. So Alysoun can go first and then followed by Pam, Michelle, and Paul. And again, thank you all.
Happy to. I think the closing remark that I would just like to make is, as we all think about our democracy, is to think about it broadly in terms of our experience of government, to think about it in terms of our experience, not only of how we choose our elected officials, but also how the relationship that we have with our election officials over the course of their time in office, and how we really be a part of the whole civic experience of our government. One of my real reflections over the course of the pandemic itself has been the extent to which election administrators are not alone. We are partners with others in local government and state government, in what we do as public administrators, in serving the voters, and we all have a shared experience with the voters that we serve and the residents of our jurisdictions in how we make sure that our government is connected to the people that we serve. And so I encourage you both to participate in the democratic process, but also to participate just generally in the civic experience of the government where you live.
Thank you so much. Pam?
You know, democracy is really an all of us effort, right? It takes everyone, it takes an enormous amount of collaboration. I really like what Alysoun said. And there was a project we did, we called it a transparency project, where we invited people to observe different aspects of their elections. And a person told me about a meeting she'd had with her local election official and how glad she was to have done this project, because she said, I feel more like a citizen now, just knowing more about it and how it all works. And boy, did that make me happy. We recently started working with some colleagues in California when some folks are trying to eliminate a particular voting system from use in a county in California. And we're seeing this in different places. This was referenced in one of the questions. A certain amount of technology is necessary at this point. Elections are complex. There's so much to it that is the part of the iceberg that's under the water that people don't see. Everything from laying out all the different ballot styles that are necessary to, making sure that the system is working for getting ballots to people and enabling ballot requests, and that it's way more than just voting on an election day and counting those votes. And in supporting the election official, one of the things we had the chance to do was work with local colleagues who pointed out what happens if you don't provide an accessible voting system. It's the law. And I really feel like, because it's an all of us effort, that's why I emphasize supporting election officials, because they're the ones that know. I've tried to make myself a smarter advocate and to provide more support because it does take collaboration. Voters are empowered the more they know, and anything we can do to amplify the voices of election officials, we'll do that.
Thank you, Pam. Michelle?
I would say I was excited to see so many of you identify technology in elections as a friend and not a foe. I think it ultimately is, because technology is making elections work better for so many more voters. I think if we just identify it as a foe and refuse to integrate it into elections, we're doing our voters a disservice. The trick is really to embrace it as a friend and then talk practically about how we can make it a reality and implement it responsibly. And I think that's really what our conversation was about today. I also like that we talked at the end here a lot about collaboration. I always say the single most important thing you can do to make elections accessible for people with disabilities is to talk to people with disabilities. Bring voters with disabilities and disability advocacy organizations into your process and let them help you. If you have polling places that are inaccessible, you're not sure what equipment is going to work best for voters, talk to people with disabilities and let them bring their expertise and what people with disabilities need to your expertise in running elections, so that we can just make the system work better for everyone. So I love that focus on collaboration.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think that technology has become more compulsory with the pandemic. We didn't have options as much as we did before. So some of the resistance that we may have felt towards technology has certainly been mitigated by the pandemic, because it was the only way that we could function. So you make some good points there. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul for closing remarks.
Thank you, Connie, and thank you to fellow panelists for their excellent wrap-ups. I agree with all of them. If we take ourselves back 3 years ago this week, some of you were getting ready to conduct elections in the spring of 2020. The pandemic had just hit, and people were wondering, how am I going to do this? And election officials, they did what they had to do to serve their voters, including adding technology and innovations to do so. But then we had the November election in 2020, and the election denying, and the high distrust of technology. And, I've been involved for 38 years. I've never seen anything like it in the last 3. And, so many election officials have quit in the US. We have many new ones. A record number of new people, because people didn't want their lives to be threatened, their family to be threatened, and they left. So it's, we have to continue the stakeholder engagement, voter engagement, and do everything that's possible to build trust, build transparency into our voting systems. And this is not just the US, because you look at the recent election in Brazil and other countries where the losers, are claiming fraud and claiming, again, they have their own set of election deniers. This is a global thing that's going on, but we really need to do everything we can to overcome that, because democracy has to be strengthened everywhere. We know that, we see it every single day in our lives. And I thank you, Connie, and the fellow panelists for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you again to Paul, to Michelle, to Alysoun, and to Pam for being part of our panel on behalf of myself, on behalf of the League of Women Voters and the UN Observer team for the League of Women Voters. We're so grateful for your participation today, and for all of the participants for joining us. So this ends the webinar, and thank you again. All right.